Hello, and welcome back to the MCYT Metazine. I'm Fallguy, here with Medusa, whose piece covers platonic tropes in Dream SMP fanfiction.
Hello.
So, first off, I just wanted to start with, how did you decide what topic you wanted to analyze for this zine?
So I thought about it for a little bit, and originally one of the ideas that I had was to use something that I ended up mentioning in my analysis in the end, which is that I've been tracking statistics for MCYT fandoms for, I think, coming on 2 years now. Just the month-over-month growth of the fandom. But I couldn't figure out how to make that sound interesting in a piece, aside from if I did a lot with like graphs and infographics, and I'm not good at graphs and infographics. So I was going around going, all right, do I have any other thing that is vaguely analytical? And then I thought, oh wait, there's this topic that I've been talking about with my friends, thinking about and posting about for my entire time in the fandom, which is just the cultural impact and the narrative impact of the platonic relationships and the emphasis on platonic relationships in Dream SMP fandom. And I went, I bet I can find something to talk about with that one, and submitted it as my idea. And it turned out I definitely could find something to talk about with it.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very interesting topic to consider, and I think you've done so in a very good way.
Thank you.
Then I also wanted to ask, what would you most like people to take away from this piece?
Some of it is just that I wanted to talk about this just because I find the conversation interesting. So I just wanted to invite people into the conversation in general, talking about this as more than just the default and like talking about it as an actual narrative analysis piece. I think, particularly because a lot of people, this is their first fandom, they take it for granted that this is how fandom works. And sometimes people who are embedded in the fandom, you just keep, living with it, responding to whatever the trends are or whatever. And you don't really ever step back and look at the broader trends and look at what's going on. And I find that really interesting. And I just wanted to just invite people into that conversation and say, let's talk about this. It's cool. But aside from that, I would be interested in just highlighting some of the creativity that people bring to the table in working with these platonic relationships, whether that's relationships and tropes that were always intended to be platonic or reinterpreting tropes that are often thought of as romantic. There's just some really beautiful creativity that's being brought to the table, and people trying to interpret things that the culture are often reserved for romantic relationships. And I think it's just really cool to talk about these things and appreciate these things when they happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you definitely make analysis a lot more accessible for the average fan who's maybe not super into like statistics on their own, things like that. So it's definitely good to have someone who wants to bring people into that space and show off those numbers.
I will say it was something that I was a little bit intimidated by when I got into the Metazine server, because I am not an art student. I'm not an analysis person formally. I just get interested in things and start talking about them, usually on my blog, and talking about this from the perspective of someone who doesn't know how to do it formally was something that I was a little bit intimidated by. But I hope that people will be able to see that you don't have to know how to cite things off by heart before you start. You can just start talking to people and having the conversations, and that's totally something that anyone can do, I think.
Absolutely, it is. What are you proudest of in this piece?
I think, honestly, I'm pretty proud of making a cohesive whole. When I started, because the conceit of my piece was doing interviews with different writers from different perspectives on this topic, and I started to get some fairly disparate viewpoints, including people who really enjoyed their time and really enjoyed the trends, and people who really thought there were negative aspects to it, or people who felt at times trapped by the trends, and people who thought that this was very cool and positive. And so initially, when I got all of these things together, I was like, how on earth am I going to boil this down into something cohesive in 2,500 words? But I'm pretty proud that I think I managed to boil it down fairly fairly effectively sort of an overview of at least one side of the fandom and the various different effects and approaches that these fandom trends had.
Yeah, I think you do a great job of synthesizing what all of those different authors had to say and making a cohesive argument with it. And not even argument necessarily, just an overview more, I think.
Yeah, I didn't really have an argument as much as I just wanted to be like, hey, this is cool, let's talk about it.
Which is a perfectly valid and very good reason for writing something like this. Is there anything from this piece that you'll be taking with you into the future?
The biggest thing is when I started it, I kept going, oh man, I could delve into other aspects. I could expand this idea. And I didn't really have the space to do that or the time to do it. And some of the questions that came up, I would have to go back to my original interviewees and ask them again. So like it wouldn't work in this one. But I have definitely not tapped out my interest in this topic. There's an entire interview that I had that I didn't have space to cover the points that were brought up that I would have loved to. And I also, a lot of my focus was in talking to people who mainly wrote platonic and enjoyed that. But I would love to talk to more people who wrote romance or read a lot of romance and dealt with the fandom atmosphere, both good and bad, during this time. And I didn't really have the space to go into that. So we'll see if in about 2 years there's part 2 of this, which is this idea redux.
Yes, and we'll be looking forward to it, I'm sure. Is there anything else from the creative process that you'd like to share? Are there any details or points that you'd like to highlight?
A big thing was because I've written posts on this topic before and on sort of related topic on platonic trends, the different trends on platonic relationships and queer platonic relationships and depiction of different themes, but it's always just been my opinion. But I didn't expect how fun it was to actually do interviews and try and structure pieces and talk to people and get more opinions in on this topic, including people who felt very strongly on the topic or people who were just sort of like, yeah, that's cool. And I think any specific points that people made are in the piece, but I would just like to encourage anyone who reads the piece or listens to this, interviewing people is really fun. Consider interviewing people.
I also can concur that interviewing is quite fun. I love coming up with questions for people and highlighting all of these things. It's one of my favorite parts of this process so far. So the format of your essay specifically is rather different from most of the others since you've used so many interviews from fic authors. And I think it's quite effective at showing just how widespread platonic relationships are in the Dream SMP fandom. How did you come up with the idea to make your point using so many different quotes in interviews specifically?
I think this just came in because my initial interview spread was fairly wide. When I was initially conceiving this, I had the idea that it was going to be just a few small quotes and maybe my thoughts. And then I started thinking, okay, I'm going to want a perspective from this sort of person. I'm going to want a perspective from this sort of person. And I'm going to want a perspective from this sort of person. I'm going to want the queer platonic perspective and the family dynamic perspective and lots of different ideas. And then once I got those interviews, I think I started with something like 6 or 8 different interviews. People had said really interesting things, and I really wanted to highlight that. And then it just sort of came naturally because I wanted to show off all of the interesting things people were saying. And my weighing in on it became less important than sort of highlighting and trying together a cohesive whole out of all of the different pieces that people said. So this is actually one of my less opinionated meta pieces, because it's less of my voice and more of me bringing other people to the front and being like, listen to what they're saying. It's interesting. So it was not planned. It just happened.
It just sort of took over. But I think it definitely works for the overview and almost point that you're trying to make of just highlighting all of those different opinions. I think it works very well.
Thank you.
So this topic specifically had the chance to be quite controversial, but I think your format for it prevents it from appearing confrontational on any level, because it's not. It's a conversation like all of fandom. And I think that using all of the interviews has helped steer it away from any potential controversiality and more into, here's a conversation, maybe we start talking about this.
I'm glad to hear that. That is something that when I was starting with, it was actually some of the mod feedback that I got that I had been like very careful to stay away from certain topics that I felt might be too controversial or too much of just a can of worms to open up. And the mods were like, yeah, go for it. Bring in broader perspective. So I very carefully started bringing in other works and interviews and pulling different parts of the interviews out. But because I do think there is a version of this piece that could be much more offensive, not in the sense of like rude, but in the sense of like going for the throat. But I didn't want to make that one. I just wanted to talk about it. I just am interested in all of the different perspectives people bring to the table on this topic. And I'm glad that you think I was able to bring it forward in a reasonable way.
Of course. So outside of this specific piece, you're quite a prolific analyst in the MCYT fandom already, as you mentioned earlier. And of course, you've cited your own data analysis in this work. Do you feel you're drawing on any of your other analyses here?
Not directly, other than the fact that the topic of what's going on narratively with Platonic writing is something that I've been interested in for a while. One of the ones that I thought ultimately was not a good fit for the zine was talking about more specifically Platonic kink writing, which has seen a surge of in the MCYT community, which didn't seem like a great fit for this specific venue. But I've thought about that and thought about taking things that in another fandom would be romantic or sexual and approaching it from a platonic lens for a while. But a lot of the direct analysis that I've done has been on that topic or on more specifically queer platonic relationships, which was too broad of a topic for this venue. So other than the fact that I've been thinking about this for about 4 years now, I don't think I brought in too much of my other stuff just because the topic is too broad. There's definitely a full 20,000 word meta to be had on this topic, and I'm just skimming the surface.
Absolutely, which has its own merits, and especially in a zine. I also hope that people read this zine and get ideas of, ooh, that's an interesting short piece. Maybe I should go research it more and write something a bit longer on it. I hope that we can inspire those sorts of people to go and get more interested in analysis as well.
Absolutely. One of the things that I was really excited about with this zine is celebrating the fandom tradition of meta and analysis, which I have really enjoyed seeing. And if we get more of people going, yes, this is also fanish work, I'd love to see more of it, then I'd be super enthusiastic if we see more of that on different topics in the future.
So, Dream SMP is, of course, the fandom that you're most familiar with, but do you have any thoughts on the prevalence of platonic relationships in other MCYT fandoms? Do you think that they're more likely to have more or fewer platonic focused fics than Dream SMP?
I haven't done specific analysis on other fandoms, so I only have anecdotal evidence. So only get the sense of what I see happening in events and what I see going by my dash. But I think the specific social pressures that made Dream SMP so focused on platonic are not necessarily present in other fandoms, such as, like, for example, Hermitcraft. For Hermitcraft, all of the hermits are older. There is often less direct contact between the hermits and their fans, or the hermits are not interested in sort of encouraging the direct contact between their fans and themselves, which initially in Dream SMP fandom, we did have a lot of people weighing in on boundaries, weighing in on fandom topics. And a lot of creators have taken a step away from that now. But at the time we had that, and there seems to be less of that going on in the big MCYT fandom at the time, which is Hermitcraft or Traffic Life series. So my impression is that you have less of the expectation of platonic relationships and more of a celebration of platonic relationships, which you still get. and I think is awesome. But it's a different sort of pressure cooker for people to be coming up with ideas and pursuing themes in. So the specific elements that made Dream SMP and the trends within that fandom were very specific. I didn't really get into it in the piece, but the sense of a prohibition against romantic writing is a big element that was also like repurposed into like a focus and a celebration as well. But you definitely had both the carrot and the stick in Dream SMP, and that varies from fandom to fandom. I have heard other fandoms also have a little more of the social pressure towards writing platonic stuff, but I have not kept up with specific fandom trends in some of the more niche fandoms or other ones. So it really varies. I do think MCYT as a whole is more platonic focused than a lot of other fandoms that I see out when I'm doing multi-fandom exchanges or out in the world. But the specific elements that made Dream SMP so focused on platonic relationships are hard to reproduce unless you have some very specific elements in play. So I'm not sure we're going to see anything like that unless you have instances of like openly arrow ace characters or that sort of thing. I just don't think we're going to get exactly the same sort of culture on the go.
Yeah, and MCYT, of course, covers so many fandoms.
It's so
that
broad.
have so many different factors playing in.
It's something I see a lot. My other hat that I wear, aside from being a fan writer, is an event runner. And one of the things that I really enjoy seeing is I'm off in my section of fandom with my Blorbos, who I've been holding steady with for like 4 years now. But there's so many different MCYTs, there's so many different SMPs, fandoms, people doing innovative things with storytelling. And that's just in English. There's so much in other languages as well. It's honestly a really broad space with a lot of different subcultures, and really interesting to try and navigate that just as an event runner and as a fandom member with my fandom neighbors, as they have very different things on the go. But yeah, it's hard to make a ruling across the genre as a whole because it's legitimately so diverse.
Yeah, of course, of course. I was also wondering if there are any romantic tropes that you really enjoy that you haven't seen as platonic fics yet in Dream SMP.
So I was sort of thinking about this when I was reviewing for the interview and sort of laughing because two of the romantic tropes that I really enjoy are war prize, like captivity, forced proximity romances, and arranged marriages, both of which I like for arrow reasons, but sort of being forced into a space and then learning to get along with the people who are also trapped in it with you is a thing that interests me. And I was thinking to myself, it's really hard to make a platonic version of that. I don't know that that one's going to make the jump because these are things that are so focused in on the growth of romance and that specific relationship. And then I sat back that one and just sort of wrapped myself in the head because I literally interviewed people who had done platonic versions of this. So I think I would be excited to see more of that in the future, more people exploring the dynamics of like being forced into a setting and having to deal with it and uneven power dynamics and how you navigate that in a fair or safe way, and arranged marriage, which I'm just a sucker for. But people are already doing it. I literally opened up the front page of the tag when I was doing my final revisions for the piece, and I was looking to see the percentage of platonic works. And there was platonic kidnapping and forced family, dark romance, except platonic on the front page. And there was platonic omegaverse on the front page, which are both tropes that in other fandoms, people would first assume to be romantic, but this fandom has taken on and repurposed and is celebrating perfectly happily with an ampersand relationship. So I think it is legitimately at this point difficult to find a romantic trope that people are not already doing as platonic, because the fandom has literally looked at everything and been like, yeah, I can make that platonic. Awesome, let's go for it. And just taken everything and repurposed it into new relationships and new ideas. There's a lot of creativity out there, which is delightful to see in terms of people taking and repurposing existing stories.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to hear that there's so much that's already been done in a platonic way. That's really nice to hear, actually. Maybe I should go looking for a few of those.
And if it's, because I know you're not as Dream SMP focused, but if you want to infiltrate your other fandoms and bring in more platonic, or the specific niche that I love is queer platonic and aro stories, and we could always use more of those. Infiltrate that into every fandom.
Oh, I have been. I think it's pretty safe to say that if I've ever written a relationship, it's queer platonic.
I've seen your fics, yeah.
Well, that's all of the main questions that I have for you, but I was also wondering if there's anything from this essay that you'd consider expanding on in the future. Now, I know that you said you might expand on it in maybe a couple years whenever you've got time, but is there anything specific that you'd like to touch on in the future?
The big question that I had when I was going through the essay and revising it, and I was sending it out to friends to be like, I don't know, academia, is this a real essay? Is this whole focus is very much focused on platonic writers and the platonic side of things and the cultural trends analyzed from a platonic point of view. And I mean, one of the things is in a culture where everything is already being used, it's kind of the opposite version that platonic writers sometimes have, where so many of the cultural markers we have for love and affection and closeness are considered to be romance. And so you're trying to demonstrate closeness and loyalty and all these things, and it can read as romance to the unprepared reader or someone who hasn't checked the tags or whatever. But within Dream SMP fandom, we almost begin to have the other version, where everything is established to be platonic. So when you're trying to establish the other way, how do you even do that? And sort of analyzing how to make a romance feel real, how to lean into a slash relationship in a setting where the fandom culture is not really interested in that, or is only interested in that covertly. I've definitely seen instances where romantically tagged relationships will have high hits, but very few kudos or comments because people don't want to openly interact with it. And just what is the other side of that coin when it comes to platonic relationships and the fan culture? Because Dream SMP was the first fan culture that I really immersed myself in and started taking notes on. And I do find it endlessly fascinating. So coming at this again from the other angle is something that I have a few ideas sort of in the crock pot in the back of my mind.
Yes, I would definitely love to see that, because I know when I was first reviewing your piece, I was seeing one side of the story and I was like, I really wonder what it's like on the other side for the romantic writers in the fandom.
Absolutely. And I did interview a couple romantic writers, but I ran out of space, really. I had an entire interview that I couldn't get into the points at all. And I couldn't really target the questions on that topic because I had already asked very specific questions and very specific ideas from the platonic side. So if there's a Metazine 2, I'm going to be in there replying with, okay, can I do the same topic, but different? It may be premature to be asking you guys to make a whole nother zine. We're very much in the midst of things.
Yes, we'll see where it goes. But yeah, I would love to see that essay in the future. All right, so that's everything I've got for you. Do you have any questions for me before we finish it off?
I'm good.
All right, sounds good. Then in that case, thank you so much for your time. It was really fun going so in-depth to some of these questions with you. And just thank you for joining us in the zine overall.
Thank you. It's been a delightful process to be part of the zine, and I'm really excited to see the finished product when it comes out.
You can check out this piece and all the other pieces for the MCYT Metazine when it releases. See you then!